Anyway, first I want to thank Mission Road for hosting this event and my show. You guys are amazing. And you all are so amazing for coming out tonight. Thank you. And this evening, it is my supreme pleasure to introduce curator and longtime friend Hamza Walker. Mr. Walker and I met in 1995, 20 years ago, when he wrote the first and still one of my favorite pieces of writing on my work. I quote him, "Amidst all the talk about the return to beauty, I find these paintings affirmative. They make me feel like I could eat shit and fly." And it's safe to say that beauty won't return until it's negotiated the smell of roses with that of shit. And Hamza was the first person who in 2005 read my manifesto, and he snatched the draft of it out of my hands and insisted on reading it publicly and then encouraging me to get it out there. Hamza and I have been discussing art and, of course, painting in particular since day one. He has seen my work at every stage, despite the fact that we have lived in separate cities most of the time. So when Mission Road asked me to think about events I would like to have in conjunction with my show here, I immediately knew I wanted to invite Hamza to give a lecture. Hamza is a legendary lecturer, interviewer, panelist, and conversationalist. He's a bibliophile with a book habit and has been collecting all of those black and white gallery exhibition catalogs from the past 40-ish or so years. And in what I know about his grad seminar lectures, he recreates these shows in slide form by locating the color versions of the paintings and reanimating the exhibitions from the, quote, historically important ones to the, quote, other ones. So if what we're going to get tonight is anywhere near this, then we are in for a real treat. Since 1994, Hamza Walker has been the Director of Education and an Associate Curator at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, which is a non-collecting museum devoted to contemporary art. This past Sunday, his most recent project opened at the Renaissance Society, Wadada Leo Smith, on Chromation, the language scores 1967 to 2015, which he co-curated with John Corbett. And just over 2 weeks prior to that, his exhibition, A Painting is a Painting Isn't a Painting, a group show, opened at the Cadiz Foundation in San Francisco. Other recent curatorial projects at the Ren include Teen Paranormal Romance, 2014, and Suicide Narcissus, 2013. Hamza has contributed reviews and art criticism to Parquet and Art Forum, in addition to numerous catalog essays on artists ranging from Haimo Zomnig to Raymond Pettibone. Prior to his position at the Renaissance Society, he worked as a public art coordinator for Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs. For several years before its closing, he served on the board of Randolph Street Gallery and is currently on the boards of Noon, which is an annual publication of short fiction, and Lampo, a nonprofit presenter of new and experimental music. Hamza is the recipient of the 1999 Norton Curatorial Grant and the 2004 Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement. In 2010, he was awarded the Ordway Prize for contributions to the field in the form of writing and exhibitions. Currently, he is co-curator along with Aram Moshayetti of Made in LA at the Hammer Museum, opening in 2016. So it's my huge, huge pleasure to introduce Hamza Walker.
Thanks to everybody here at 356. Can you hear? Is this loud enough? Hey, how you doing, man? Ethan, Rebecca for the invitation, Ethan, Leah, Sophia, Chloe, you guys are great. Last but not least, Ms. Owens. So this isn't half-baked, it's completely baked. So this is as fresh as it gets. In 1969, Daniel Buren penned his seminal essay, Beware, on the occasion of his inclusion in Conception, Documentation of Today's Art Tendencies, a survey of conceptual art curated by Konrad Fischer for the Museum Morsbrecht in Leverkusen, Germany. It was a who's who of the American and European avant-garde. What better opportunity to express umbrage taken at conceptual art? An umbrage cloaked as grave reservations, as the title Beware suggests. All pun intended, Buren's polemic begins straight out of the gate with the infamous quote, "Concept has never meant horse." His barbs have yet to dull over time. Take, for example, his remark about a mannerist conceptual art. Quote, "In order, no doubt, to get closer to reality, the conceptual artist becomes gardener, scientist, sociologist, philosopher, storyteller, chemist, sportsman," end quote. As the artist Joe Scanlon has said, and indeed shown, quote, "All you have to do is replace conceptual artists with relational aesthetics or social practices, and the essay reads as applicable to this very moment." But Buren's barbs are sharp ultimately because he has skin in the game. He developed his in situ method of working through an extremely rigorous line of thinking about the dematerialization of art, which was not to be taken lightly. If anything, Beware expresses his fears about its trivialization. His warning regarding the dematerialization of the object is the last of 4 numbered bullet points whose heading reads, "Concept equal idea equal art." Quote, "Lastly, more than one person will be tempted to take any sort of an idea, to make art of it, and to call it a concept. It is this procedure which seems to us to be the most dangerous, because it is more difficult to dislodge, because it is very attractive, because it raises a problem that really does exist: how to dispose of the object," end quote. Buren was bothered by the thought of conceptual art devolving into a trend, a new style of art, at which point it becomes, quote, "the prevailing ideology." The problems the movement sought to address are then considered solved. These solutions become the new art, which, according to Buren, is simply the old art in a new form. Buren's work was aimed precisely at the problem of form, specifically its neutralization, which was tantamount to the dematerialization of art. The neutralization of form was a problem that can only be addressed in a sustained fashion, in a manner that would re-articulate rather than resolve the problem. By 1969, Buren had spent 4 years working, quote, "without any evolution or way out." However polemical the essay, Buren is equally explicit about his methodology. It begins with a call for a painting that is non-illusionistic, not in the sense of being merely abstract, but abstract to the point of being its own reality. In other words, it is a call for a purely self-referential painting, one that is staunchly anti-illusionistic in that it doesn't refer to anything outside of itself. Quote, "In the same way that writing is less and less a matter of verbal transcription, painting should no longer be the vague vision/illusion, even mental, of a phenomenon, nature, subconscious, geometry, but visuality of the painting itself." Reread the last sentence. "In the same way that writing is less and less a matter of verbal transcription, painting should no longer be the vague vision/illusion, even mental, of a phenomenon, but it should be visuality of the painting itself. In this way, we arrive at a method which requires that painting itself should create a mode, a specific system, which no longer directs attention, but which is produced to be looked at," end quote. Hence, the evenly spaced vertical stripes, each band being 8.7 centimeters wide and a single color alternating with white. Colors are deployed in a systematically democratic fashion such that they are equally interchangeable. Black equals red equals green equals blue equals yellow. Interchangeable from one work to the next. As a succession of bands of equal width filling up the painting side to side, whatever composition there is to speak of is completely neutral insofar as the part-to-whole relationship is evenly dispersed across the surface area. There is no contradiction, only an evenly distributed alternation of equal forms. Without contradiction, by default, there is no tragedy. That's a quote from Buren. Without contradiction, by default, there is no tragedy, which in Buren's case is a euphemism for anthropomorphism. The stripes, likewise, dispense with the horizon line. There's only the top and the bottom. This succession of bands is a system resulting in a fixed internal structure. The internal structure of the painting is independent of its external dimensions, which are allowed to vary depending wholly on circumstances. With the stripe motif as a constant, repetition became Buren's starting point. It was the means to highlight the ever-changing context of the venue, be it in or outside the museum gallery. Buren's work could assume a variety of forms and be placed in a variety of settings where they could directly address specific formal and/or socio-political aspects of their location. By extending/transferring the logic of painting's self-reflexivity onto context, Buren would place painting, as opposed to the ready-made, at the core of institutional critique. At the time of Buren's publication, he'd been producing his signature stripe works for 4 years. In that time, his stripes had come to exemplify conceptual art. This, however, would eclipse the fact that Buren had arrived at the stripe in empirical fashion, as the paintings over the course of 1964 through 65 make abundantly clear. Let's see. Let's close that out. Let's close this one out. This one. Okay. So this is a series of works Buren created before arriving at his signature stripe pieces. This is 1964. So these are all 64 into 65. 64. June of 65. Right. So these are actually just cut pieces of fabric in these irregular shapes. So now he's just painting directly onto the fabric. So now we're headed into 66. So Buren's work perfects the paradigm of an art for art's sake. Any formal evolution within painting is replaced by repetition. The emphasis previously reserved for individual paintings is shifted on to a logic of production, or a methodology. This shift corresponds to another shift, namely a shift from the empirical to the theoretical, come again as the ideological. For Buren, the ideological assumes the form of a recurring proposition. As such, it is anything but absolute. The transitional works from 64 to 65 and to 66 are remarkable in that they literally illustrate the perfecting of an art for art's sake paradigm in which the terminating logic of the monochrome is being substituted with a generative logic belonging to what else but pattern painting. So this is a later Daniel Buren in situ work as an example, where he's made sails for a regatta, which go on the museum walls, and then when they're not in use, or when they are in use, this is what gets put up. So that's just an example. Right? So the claim there being Daniel Buren as pattern painter. Should anyone have doubts about speculations regarding Daniel Buren as the ultimate P&D painter, I call to the witness stand Louis Vuitton. This is the 2013 Buren-Vuitton collaboration. Buren provided the sets for the Spring Fashion Week unveiling of Vuitton's line. And continuing, I'd like to juxtapose the Buren-Vuitton collaboration with the performances of a seminal member of P&D, Robert Kushner. Kushner's performances grew out of an interest in both movement and costuming, an interest he developed during his early years as an artist in San Diego, having attended UCSD. Later, food was integrated into the costumes, and Kushner began staging performances that developed into fashion shows, a series of which he would mount in New York throughout the 1970s, these images being from 1972 to 1975. On the right is Kushner, on the left is Buren and Marc Jacob / Vuitton. This is the cheekier part of this evening. I found the one on the left online. Picture it in the frozen food aisle. Just do it. No, picture that in the frozen food aisle. And just do it. And this is a performance from 1975 of Kushner's at the Kitchen. And this is from his Persian line, as he called it. But what about pattern and decoration proper? As a movement, P&D began in 1975 over a series of 3 discrete events. The first was a panel at Artist Space titled The Pattern in Painting. It included Martin Bresler, Rosalind Hodgkins, Valerie Jowden, Tony Robbin, and Stanford Wormfeld. The second and most seminal event was a pattern meeting at Robert Zakanich's Warren Street loft. Attendees included Amy Golden, art historian and critic Leonore Goldberg, Rosalind Hodgkins again, Valerie Jowden, Joyce Kozloff, Robert Kushner, Tony Robbin, Miriam Shapiro, Kendall Shaw, Nina Yankowitz, and Zakanich. The third event was the opening of Holly Solomon Gallery, which debuted with a group exhibition that included 19 artists, among them Kushner, Kim McConnell, and Ned Smith, all of whom were core P&D subscribers. The premiere was followed by a solo show of Brad Davis's work, and shortly thereafter, a solo show by Kim McConnell. A steady stream of panels, meetings, and exhibitions continued unabated over the next 2 years, culminating in the 1977 survey, Pattern Painting, at PS1, curated by art critic John Perot. So now our series of slides by the core members of P&D. So this is Zachanich. You'll have to excuse me, I didn't get the titles and sizes. But I believe that this is from the Sofa series. All of the works are between 1972 and I don't think I went beyond 1982. In the case of Zachanich, I know I didn't go beyond 1980. So these are all square, mid-70s works. This is Tony Robbin. And these are probably roughly at the scale that is projected. Robert Kushner. This one's called Two Lost Bunnies. And I believe this one might be called Starstruck, but I chose it because it was in the Billy Wilder collection. Oh yeah, that's his title. Visions Beyond the Pearly Curtain, 75. So that's 120 by 202 inches. This is Brad Davis. Valerie Jowden. And a number of these have names. She's a Mississippi gal. A number of these have names of towns in the South. This is a smaller painting, around 18 by 18. This is Kim McConnell. Joyce Kozloff. Even though she's done a lot of mosaic and tile work, this is a work on canvas, acrylic painting. Futurist painting with 15 squares is the title of this one. It's Miriam Shapiro. This piece is called Procession. This one's called Connection. While P&D is not a feminist movement, it is inconceivable without feminism, which lent it a critical platform as well as a means of networking. As for the latter, relationships between P&D's key female members, Kozlov, Jowden, Shapiro, were cemented a few years earlier through their involvement with the women's movement on both coasts. The feminist collectives that formed throughout the United States were self-determined groups, and P&D was no different. In calling to order a pattern meeting, Zachanich consciously wanted to build a movement around overtly decorative work. As for how to do this, Zachanich couldn't have picked a more ideal role model than Miriam Shapiro, to whom he turned for advice. In regards to lending P&D a critical platform, over and above redeeming the decorative, celebrating as a form of women's work, feminism gave P&D an oppositional edge. Feminism's emergence within the visual arts is concurrent with minimalism, which, ideologically speaking, is a purely self-referential art, making it a zenith of modernism. Referring to nothing outside of itself, it is an art predicated on the exclusion of history, memory, biography, race, and gender. This would prove an anathema for women and people of color actively engaged in the struggle to find voice and political agency. As a result, feminism had no choice but to be anti-modern insofar as modernism was anti-feminine. The anti-modernism endemic to feminism was part and parcel of P&D. A prime example is Kozlov's 1977 two-part manifesto. The first section is titled Negating the Negative, in answer to Ad Reinhardt's On Negation, and the second is titled On Affirmation. Anti-pure, anti-purist, anti-puritanical, anti-minimalist, anti-post-minimalist, anti-reductivist, anti-formalist, anti-pristine, anti-austere, anti-bare, anti-blank, anti-bland, anti-boring, anti-empty, anti-dull, anti-monotonous, anti-flat, anti-picture plane, anti-sterile, anti-clean, anti-sanitized, anti-machine-made, anti-technological, anti-computerized, anti-universal, anti-internationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-Bauhausist, anti-dominant, anti-authoritarian, anti-mandarinist, anti-mainstreamist, anti-transcendent, anti-rigid, anti-systemic, anti-linguisticized, anti-bureaucraticized, anti-black, anti-white, anti-gray, anti-grid, anti-God, anti-moralistic, anti-religious, anti-priestly, anti-mystifying, anti-mystical, anti-orthodox, anti-logic, anti-conceptual, anti-male dominated, anti-virile, anti-tough, anti-cool, anti-cruel, anti-cold, anti-rational, anti-absolutist, anti-academic, anti-dogmatic, anti-didactic, anti-doctrinaire, anti-aesthetic, anti-classicist, anti-hermetic, anti-exclusivist, anti-idealist, anti-conventionalist, anti-determinist, anti-programmatic, anti-dehumanized, anti-unintelligible, anti-sophisticated, anti-disinterested, anti-uninteresting, anti-detached, anti-emotionless, anti-meaningless, anti-formless, anti-colorless, anti-lineless, anti-spaceless, anti-lightness, anti-textureless, anti-imageless, anti-timeless, anti-deathless, anti-lifeless, anti-breathless, anti-elitist, anti-historicist, anti-loveless, anti-sexless, anti-pleasureless, anti-funless, anti-jargonized, anti-structuralist, anti-dictatorial, anti-ordered, anti-closed, anti-controlled, anti-controlling, anti-arrogant, anti-sublime, anti-grandiose, anti-pedantic, anti-pretentious, anti-pompous, anti-patriarchal, anti-heroic, anti-genuous, anti-master. On affirmation. Additive, subjective, romantic, imaginative, personal, autobiographical, whimsical, narrative, decorative, lyrical, architectural, sculptural, primitive, eccentric, local, specific, spontaneous, irrational, private, impulsive, gestural, handwritten, handmade, colorful, joyful, obsessive, fussy, funny, funky, vulgar, perverse, mannerist, tribal, rococo, tactile, self-referring, sumptuous, salacious, eclectic, exotic, messy, monstrous, complex, ornamented, embroidered, articulated, spatial, light-filled, delicate, warm, open, questioning, sharing. The wrong way. P&D's oppositional position, to a large extent, overshadows its heterogeneity as a movement. All of the P&D artists embraced pattern and ornament well before it was a movement, arriving at their own artistic conclusion for different reasons, hardly any of which could be said to be reactionary. McConnell and Kushner were students at UCSD when they fell under the sway of Islamic art. Amy Golden's tutelage was key to their exploration of non-Western art, an exploration that formed out of a passion for Asian and Middle Eastern art and artifacts. Zachanich cites autobiographical sources for his turn toward ornament. Quote, "In my grandparents' house, ornamentation was everywhere. They had embroidered tablecloths and armrests. They used stencils to paint flower patterns on their walls, which gave me an affinity for stencils. My grandparents refused to live in a bleak, empty room and decorated everything." Valerie Jowden's work draws from architectural ornamentation, but the work belongs as much to a hard-edged geometric abstract tradition as it does P&D. The same can be said of Tony Robbin. All of this to say that despite the oppositional tone of P&D as a movement, its tributaries were hardly reactionary. The sources from which these artists drew their inspiration, even when they were modernist sources, were revered. This is important in that P&D, no matter how anti-modern, was never ironic. This is no small feat for what many acknowledge as postmodernism's first movement, with Peter Halley's Neo Geo being a very close second. Rebecca Morris is a child of postmodern irony. That said, Morris's commitment to abstraction lies somewhere between the poles of fierce and rabid, a prerequisite for coping with a pluralism arising not only from across disciplines, but from within the discipline of painting itself. Abstraction is now a given, an option that is taken for granted as one chooses rather than fights to become an abstract painter. It is a choice, however, within a discipline that has become a field of specialization by virtue of taking on the characteristics of a language. If the closure of modernist painting is taken as the closure of painting itself, then under the aegis of postmodernism, painting's history is a finite collection of styles, readily offering itself up for quotation. In other words, paintings are read in and through references to other paintings, begging the question, once abstraction has acquired this kind of legibility, is there such a thing as an abstract painting? And this is shorthand for understanding abstraction as an allegory for modernism. Judging from Morris's work, the answer is a resounding hell yeah. Hers remains a rudimentary language of shape, line, color, gesture, surface, and composition that quotes so as to reduce its references to an alphabet. In this respect, her paintings function as an or proto-language of abstraction through which one might discern the compositional logic of a Frank Stella Black painting, an isolated Pollock-like splatter, or a Hans Hofmannesque approach to the discrete juxtaposition of color. So these are relatively early works, going back to the late 90s. It's a grab bag. I think this one is called Greased Lightning. I think that brings us up to around 2000. The earliest paintings in the group just shown feature Morris's signature device of layering a shape that is an undifferentiated hybrid of square and circle. Executed flat on the floor, these paintings look as though they have emerged face up from a boiling cauldron of protozoan possibilities dating back to the Flintstones. Between these and her paintings consisting exclusively of lines, her early vocabulary was indeed one of sticks and stones. When not registered as a scrubby stain or a series of wavering, spray-painted lines, her touch consists of a redundant slathering of viscous paint that builds in thickness, going from painting as a verb to painting as a noun. On stretches deeper than required for paintings of their size, these canvases assert their objecthood so literally they become rhetorical. Facture is determined by gravity and the drying properties of oil, which contracts as it congeals, forming a skin with an unctuous, hive-like wrinkling that seems to emerge from within the paintings. With a life of their own, the paintings become susceptible to a premature aging, a form of corruption well beyond any irony. Morris's earlier paintings could hardly be said to escape such irony, which is endemic to any and all questions of legibility. Whatever irony may be attributed to her intent, however, corresponds to history's larger irony, which was already well in effect. Submitting abstraction to a process of quotation that reduces stylistic specificity to very basic and general features is to craft a generic abstraction, one that cannot fail to signify abstraction's utter ubiquity. Little wonder these early paintings resemble a species of abstraction found in transient public spaces, fast food dining courts, airport terminals, the DMV. Once considered an ideal complement to public spaces because of its universal appeal, abstract art came to be read as a gratuitous effort to beautify impersonal spaces of rote functionality. These spaces, with their accepted levels of vagrancy and dereliction, often resulting from the public's very absence, were in effect non-spaces. Abstraction spoke for no one, becoming a vacant language. Referring to figurative elements lacking a place within abstract paintings, Clement Greenberg coined the infamous phrase, homeless representation. If the dialectical pendulum of history has undergone a full cycle, then it's safe to say Morris's early paintings are a species of homeless abstraction. And so these go back to 96. Sorry, they're a little fuzzy, pixelation-wise, but this is what I meant by a generic abstraction. Right, and here these double chevron. Oh, it's a chevron, split down the center. But it has that kind of unctuous congealed paint to make up the stripes. Morris's predilection for a scathed abstraction is a way of welcoming it and its subsequent fate arms open wide. As for an attendant irony, let there be no mystery as to what she would say. Bring it on. For painters who share Morris's commitment to abstraction, the challenge is to reinvent on terms that are relevant and relative the spirit and dialectical conditions that make abstract painting urgent and necessary. For the better part of the 20th century, this struggle was defined by a dialectical tension between abstraction and figuration. In Morris's case, the struggle is defined by an irony residing exclusively within the domain of abstract painting. In short, abstract painting has nothing to overcome but itself. This is an irony Morris is bold enough to instigate, and even bolder for transcending, as the paintings over the past decade have increased in scale and complexity on every front: palette, paint handling, and composition, including notable forays into crafting deep space, making them robust enough to dispel any question of whether this is painting for painting's sake. The struggle from one generation to the next might be different, but the goal of making paintings of which nothing is asked other than that they be paintings remains the same. Indeed, Morris's paintings are anachronisms. Her method of reducing any attributable stylistic specificity to rudimentary painterly concerns negates the idea that abstract painting would, could, or should evolve. Her sticks and stones period could just as easily serve as a paean to Kandinsky's point and line to plane, as it could be said to reference the New York school. Although the advent of pure abstraction is a thing of the past, it was not marked as belonging exclusively to the early years of the 20th century, or the New York school. Abstraction now belongs to the ages. This problematizes any claims to contemporaneity made on abstraction's behalf. Hovering outside an historical dialectic, abstraction operates at its own speed. At times, it's been ahead of its present, and at others, behind. Several of Morris's paintings circa 2000 might recall the 1980s better than a painting actually executed during that decade ever could. And now, she seems to be working her way further back, her work having skirmishes with P&D. So that's Kim McConnell on the left and Rebecca on the right. And here it has to do with this framing and bordering. That seemed to be a consistent feature of pattern and decoration. That's Brad Davis on the right. Miriam Shapiro on the right. And Robert Kushner on the right. It's easy to be ironic about P&D. It's hard to look it in the eye, and even harder to avail oneself to a course of painterly exploration in which you don't get to choose your bedfellows. Such is the case with Morris. This is what happens when you relinquish irony. You're subject to any way the wind blows. Rubbing shoulders with P&D, however, is to reanimate an empiricist pre-stripe Daniel Buren. If anything, I would argue that P&D, and only P&D, holds the keys to this work. This is a mosaic by Buren in 1965 that he did in Saint-Tropez, the same period that he did the work leading up to the stripe paintings. So details. And that's a Daniel Buren painting, 1965. Also Saint-Tropez. And it's this work with which Rebecca sees eye to eye. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll take questions. Oh, it's, yeah. So if you could wait for the, if you have questions, if you could wait for the microphone. Great. Yeah. Get it started. Yeah. Oh, you need the.
I'd like to talk to that.
Okay.
So Hamza, the thing that immediately came to mind towards the end when you were positing Buren's early work as a key in a way to Rebecca's work or a relationship is Buren's later work. I was sort of thinking a lot about pre the Vuitton stuff, which actually I didn't see, and I was thinking about the Pompidou show. Mm-hmm. And the Pompidou show is a kind of an exploded P&D, crazy exploded P&D, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's at the heart of the whole, at the heart of the whole thing is to, claim Daniel Buren as a pattern painter, right? So, and I think that becomes more and more apparent, especially with the recent show. I know that there was one in Italy where they actually hauled out all that 65, that work. I was blown away when I first saw that work. I was like, no shit, man. Daniel Buren actually made these paintings. He actually painted his way up to the stripes. I thought he was born a conceptual artist. And it was funnier to read Beware, where he's, declaring himself a painter, picking a fight with conceptual art. Of course, obviously, he is very much so a conceptual artist. But the more recent shows seem to, in terms of hauling out the historical work or that, pre in situ stuff, more and more makes them come off, exposes the idea again of substituting the monochrome to, that we couldn't see the stripes as for what they were in a way, as pattern painting, that they had actually, pattern painting had been absorbed and accounted for within, the kind of peak moment of modernism and kind of itself been, super reduced. But now that they've taken on, his projects have taken on a much more Baroque and fanciful character, I just kind of love, that's all out. It's like in Saint-Tropez, It's like a minimalist from the Caribbean. I've never met one.
Thank you a lot. I just wanted to ask the artist, how much sense of, if you don't mind,
No.
how much sense of conversation were you having when Hamza put up the paintings in duo like that? I mean, it was very interesting to see the dynamic between the two arts, and I was just wondering, when you made yours, were you in a conversation with those works, or were you in any sense?
It's exactly what I was afraid of coming tonight. When Hamza emailed me, he was like, is this title okay? I was like, okay. I mean, I don't want to get in his way. you know, he's sort of a genius, so it's just like he needs to
hardly.
do what he needs to do. But yeah, it was pretty freaky to see those paintings up there. I mean, I'm aware of the movement, obviously, but I don't think I'd looked at them quite in that one-to-one way, and it was really weird. I'm sorry. I don't really have a more cogent response because that was pretty crazy. And
Were all those works familiar?
no.
Yeah, that's, you know, but I think in terms of saying, it's like, you know, the turn towards, you know, ridding the work of your, it was great seeing how many P&D shows there were between, you know, 75 and 80, and who was kind of in the wings of P&D and hauled in, and one of whom was Joe Zucker, right? And I feel like, you know, and because he's not exactly a P&D character, but he's like a one-man pluralism. I don't know, but to, you know, painting the good, the bad, the ugly. Are you, the sense sometimes, do you lead the paintings or do the paintings lead you? You know, and sometimes I have a feeling these paintings, no matter how joyful or strange, but at times it's like, I don't know, you know, a delightful waywardness or something. Like, you're not, how much do you steer your own car, Rebecca, in terms of like controlling what you want the paintings to do, you know, or be in a way. Sometimes they feel like, you know, where they come from, you might not know. And so in terms of who they might rub shoulders against, you're completely open to that. And that's what's nice about the paintings, is that they aren't defensive. And that's a really key tone for me in terms of reading, especially paintings, is like how relaxed they are, how comfortable are they, you know? And I think that's when you begin to lift up the hood and get into a whole like painter psychology kind of thing. You know?
I think that's what comes when. I think that is what comes. That's why people say it takes so long to become a good painter or to really make. You know, it just takes a long time to get to a comfortable place. And it's nice that you feel that way.
Yeah, you can feel it, but then it's like who, and then what the references might be. It's like you can't, you know, P&D is like, yeah, they are your brethren, you know, and you don't know over time, like, you know, if you're, you know, every dog has his day, and if you're a good dog, you have two. You know, and so as far as like the winds of fashion with respect to what goes in, what goes out with painting, but you just have to stay the course and follow your own thing out.
Right.
You know, but I think getting rid of irony is the only way you could go back. Like, you'd have to be pretty fearless to get into a space, I think, where you're making work that you know openly flirts with, at a formal level, I think, you know, P&D, and not run the other way.
Yeah.
You know, but to follow out the logic.
I felt like the early work wasn't ironic, but I understood that it was read that way. So I remember having to really rethink how I wanted to go forward in a lot of ways. And that was a very important thing. And I think that actually that moment sort of coincided with moving to LA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I know that you were totally, you know, wholeheartedly, it's like you were as sincere as they come and dyed in the wool as a painter in terms of an attack. But it's funny the way that, the upshot is like, you know, and irony works that way. It's not a question, you know, irony is not something that is capable of being controlled by the speaker. The reader can also produce irony, you know, meaning you say one thing, but yet to the receiver of the message, it means another.
Also, irony was so in at a certain
right,
point, too.
Yeah.
So it was sort of really in the atmosphere, I remember, in the
Yeah.
like mid to late 90s, or
Yeah.
the abject, and
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I feel like that's the, the kind of generationally, and that was around the time, yeah, you know, I think of us as sort of like a very early, if not the first generation, wholly weaned on TV, like born with it and steeped in it, and therefore it's like, where does it come from? It's like, I'm being sold a false bill of goods. I was saying this since I was 5. I don't believe you. So, for it to finally come out, around that time. But to a point where we wouldn't know, it's like, well, it isn't a question of whether or not it's ironic. It's more a question of like, is it sincerely ironic? So.
Other questions? No, you totally want this.
Couldn't you say that, and I think that I felt the same way when I first saw Rebecca's work, that it is different, and that's why it seems ironic. It seems like an affront in a way, that it must in some way be like pulling your chain, or that we would almost think that like you didn't really look at those pattern and drawing painters sincerely because no one's been looking at that, and she just kind of unearthed something. And I don't know, like I could see how it's sincere and simultaneously. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much burned off. I mean, it's. What's interesting is what gets lifted, or what knowingly or not, just at a formal level, like the few things that I put up, and I wish I had more. Since I am away, I didn't realize that my laptop, I didn't have access to Art Store, so I couldn't get I think there's more premium examples of P&D work that I probably could have come up with to make the juxtapositions a little more acute. But simply at the level of a formal comparison, if you were to think about The Quilt by Kim McConnell, it's not, if you start to collage things together in a certain way, this is where this is going to go, So even though on the one hand, it's a collage or a quilt in McConnell's hands, what's interesting for me is Rebecca's rendering of that, kind of straight up as painting, right? So I feel like it's like, no, it's still, it's as if like looking at P&D, and Miriam Shapiro also did a lot of collage, in her works. But what if you could take that compositional device and just have it be straight up painting, right? So that to me begins to kind of, again, like, there's no irony there. It's actually like, wait, there's something of value or a formal thing that's going on, and like Brad Davis's use of that bordering device, that if you actually kind of lift it off of, or get rid of the dog in the middle and deal with the border as like a recurring, aspect of, a certain kind of ornamental picture making, can be interesting just as a straight up painterly device, So I think that that's what's going on in a lot of cases. So it's like a kind of lifting of the things, and and doing them in paint, and at least allowing me to see them in a way that I wouldn't, in a way, looking straight at P&D. You know? In other words, it's just more like, it's like, wait, no, you should look at this stuff at a formal level, which I never really, that's what I mean by like, look that work in the eye. You know, I never stopped to ask myself, let's like, wait a minute. Actually, if I really slow down and look at how this thing is made and what's going on here as far as a set of, you know, formal decisions in a way, you know, that they're actually quite, you know, interesting.
Which makes me start to think, is there something beyond the pendulum of irony and sincerity that ends up being something more like a facticity? Where we can consider it formally, consider it materially, without it having to take a stance.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's the kind of the you know, and obviously in your field of court, in literature, you know, formalism. And, I mean, so, you know, when Greenberg was accused of being a formalist, and it's quite amazing, he apparently was like, what? Like, wait, to my understanding, the formalists are a bunch of Russian literary critics who, it's like, yes, exactly, and you're doing exactly the same thing, but the idea that he wouldn't, you know, that he actually saw some kind of difference between what he was doing and what they were doing is quite funny. You know, first, so to say that they were not comedy or tragedy, what they were interested in is how does it work? Yeah, so lifting the hood up and actually trying to break it down, you know, what is it doing and how does it do it?
It's the making the stone stonier.
Yeah, so yeah, how did these things work? And that's as an irony-free kind of operation. Its investment isn't necessarily in affect.
We're just moving horizontally. I can't believe I'm asking this question, but let's say the person asking this question hasn't really spent much time looking at P&D work, and but has seen Rebecca's work for 25 years or so. Can you speak a little bit about surface in P&D's work as opposed to like surface in Rebecca's work, and how that sort of differences in the meaning in those differences? Because like
completely.
I've seen Rebecca's work in the studio and the pooling and all that shit.
Yeah. That's but that's what I was trying to talk about before. At a formal level, in terms of its translation into a more, I'm going to say forthright or perhaps robust, I don't know, or clear that a lot of the P&D work is quite graphic, maybe hard-edged, collage, and to try and translate that into what is clearly a very painterly surface. Okay, so I think of Rebecca working over time. She's thinned out the paint and just resorted to a much more like a kind of another means of gaining vibrancy, like downing the thickness, the kind of buttery painter, the waxy buildup. Yeah. And there are other ways to achieve painterliness as an effect, and you can actually do it with thinner paint. You can still reveal all the brushwork, all the more, in fact, with thinner paint, in some sense. And you can also gain a kind of luminosity. But I would say that has served to make the paintings more honest in terms of what they are. So the idea of taking the devices in P&D, which again are more like collage-oriented or graphic, I would say, and in some cases just like super thick, buttery, and trying to, treat them, I guess, in a more sober and straightforward. Painterly means is the operation, that I see at work. So there's a big difference between the two things, especially at that level of facture, But I would say it's, essentially Rebecca performing a formalist operation on P&D, like extracting something from it and then rendering it in paint all across one surface.
Yeah.
That was a really nice explanation, but does that reflect what your experience was when you were making the paintings?
I don't know why I was so naive that I thought that I wouldn't be a part of this. No, that's okay.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to me. And one thing I don't like about my work is when it's photographed. It really loses something. I mean, every painter will say this, but the thing I'm not liking lately is that it becomes so graphic and flat, and that it starts reading in a very different way than if you're in front of it and can really see the kind of luminous, very light touch painting application, and that's really important to me. And there are, decorative devices that I'm interested in, and I'm interested in them because they're really dangerous. Like the scallop was something I started doing a couple years ago after I'd done some zigzag, and I thought the zigzag was dangerous. But then I realized the scallop was much more dangerous than the zigzag, so I became interested in that. And I think the danger, of course, has to do with certain ideas of what is okay to do or what kind of references you're going to cull up. And I'm interested in sort of walking a tight line between things. So certain devices like using a border or certain shapes or certain color combinations do that, but then at the same time, that's not my sole interest. And that may be how I start something, but it's certainly not what holds me throughout the whole painting, or else I'd be bored, and that's just like a trope. So it's sort of a mix, I'd say, but I don't know if that answers the question well enough, but it's sort of what I've got.
It's funny, we had a really, at your show in Chicago, at John and Jim's, my sort of slow burn revelation was the increasing quilt-like nature of the I mean, obviously that was going on in the early work,
Sure.
It's really like welded together and pieced together. But there was something else, like when you removed that thick painterly thing, then I think the decision to really have them be puzzles, and it became like even more, it wasn't just a kind of a default by virtue of the paint handling, but it had, then the emphasis would fall squarely to compositional choices and composition alone, like graphically. But that you got there through the drawings. So you were using this, you were making these drawings, and your drawings underwent a really big change when you started using that resist stuff, and that they became much more quilt-like, and I felt like you transferred what you had learned from the drawings back into the paintings, which is a really great, like, because the drawings became where you began to, it seemed like, play a lot more aggressively with combinations of color and pattern. I mean, in a really more, like, kind of, I guess, ebullient, like, got to get this hen out kind of way.
Yeah, I think they had a huge effect, and that show had like a survey of drawings. Maybe there were 30 drawings up, and then 3 new paintings.
Right.
So
That's where it came up. That's
yeah,
right. Was
kind of set the stage for
right.
that
Was the reason having a show in which the drawings were so prominent.
And I had made the drawings the whole time, but I just hadn't been showing them.
Oh yeah, God, it was mounds of drawings and stuff. Yeah. So here we go. One straight back.
My question is actually specifically about P&D, because I only learned about it fairly recently as well. And My question was, I know they were looking at non-Western textiles, but were they also looking at like William Morris or painters
Oh,
who
yeah.
had, oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
And-
yeah, yeah.
And
yeah,
like,
yeah.
what about painting specifically like the Nabi?
Oh yeah,
like Benoit?
definitely Kushner would have been absorbing French symbolist paintings.
And how would you sort of tie that into maybe Buren kind of looking at pattern in a French painting legacy?
That it's the way that specifically the reason that P&D is considered the first postmodern movement is because of its embrace, say that, as opposed to like appropriation of non-Western cultures, both, you know, kind of from throughout history, so trans-historical and kind of from different points on the globe, right? So trans-geographical, and so that's what fueled. So they could just raid the kitty, in a way. So things. I mean, one of the things that was interesting, just reading about things that they were really into, the Peacock Room. I think it's at the Freer, right? They were really, that was, you know, so if they were hitting the Peacock Room, well then, you know, I mean, you know, Klimt, I mean, any of, you know, William Morris, that was all, you know, plain leopards. Buren is a much more narrow, in terms of inheriting, I would say, a trajectory of, you know, reductivist, a line of reductivist thinking in painting, right? So he, I mean, in which case I would say it's like, you know, probably Matisse, you know, is where, like, you know, in that regard, where a certain, you know, buck kind of stops. You know, it's a much more narrow. So I don't think, you know, yeah, Buren is French, but I think that the you know, he was already on board with a kind of a modernist program, right? But then again, it's Matisse, so that's pattern, right? So I think that's more, that would have been, and you know, Buren and Saint-Tropez, it's like, you know, Matisse likewise, right? So I think that would have been much more the, you know, a direct correspondence, you know, not having to go outside of that. Take one more if there's one more. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for coming out.